Well, everything I do has two themes: deglobalization, as the United States backs away from guaranteeing security that makes global trade possible, and depopulation. When the United States made global trade possible, we allowed industrialization and urbanization to spread throughout the world to places that would have never been able to pull it off before because they would either be colonies or the targets of conflicts. So by making the world safe, people started applying industry and technology to agriculture, and that allowed people to move off the farms and into the cities. So we've been in this 75-year-long urbanization phase because of those two trends. When you move from the farm into the city, you start having fewer kids, because when you're on the farm, kids are free labor. And when you are in the city, kids are really, really expensive pieces of mobile furniture that take money from you.
I'm
We're not
familiar.
stupid. We can do basic math. So we've gone in 2 generations from the average woman in the world having more than 5 kids to less than 3. And different countries have moved at different speeds. But as a rule, the poorer the country was in 1945, the faster this process has happened. The later adoptees of industrialization and globalization get to learn from everything that everyone has done before. And so in the case of China, they have gone from a rural system where the average woman had 6 kids to an urban system where the average woman has like 1.2 now in less than a lifetime. So they're going to be the first country, one of the first countries, to face a complete population crash. In the case of Russia, it was a little bit slower, but it started earlier with World War I. And by the time we get to the post-Cold War collapse, the birth rate fell so far that the Russians now, today, are simply not able to arm their or to man their army. So this is their last gasp. This is their last chance if they're going to rewrite the borders. And that brings us back to geography. Because if you look at a map of Russia, the population lives in kind of this sideways V going from the European side to the Asian side, getting thinner as it goes. But there are no natural boundaries around it, no oceans, no mountains, no deserts. It's a lot of open territory that the Mongols crossed, the Germans crossed. They've been invaded 50 times. But all 50 of those times, the invader has come through one of 9 gateway territories, like the Polish Gap or the Bessarabian Gap. So the Russian plan is, with this last chance they have, to forward deploy to those gaps and plug them before they lose the military capacity to even try. So this was always their last chance. And Ukraine was never the end of it. It's actually step 4, I would argue, after things like Crimea and Georgia and Nagorno-Karabakh and Kazakhstan. And it's not the end, because they still have to get to Bessarabia, they still have to get to Poland, they still have to get to the Baltic. So when they're done with Ukraine, we still have 6 more countries. We don't have good data anymore. Yeah. They really stopped reporting that several years ago. They started just fabricating stuff. But as of the last time that they reported data that was somewhat trustworthy, it was 59. Average age of male mortality, is now below the retirement age. And there's not a lot of leadership left. We're in this weird situation because of the demographics that they now have a total national elite of probably only about 150 people.
Wow.
And so every time one of them slips in the shower and falls on some bullets or chokes on a chicken bone or whatever it happens to be, it's a national crisis, because these people are irreplaceable. They're survivors from the KGB cadre from the late Cold War. They haven't trained up any new ones. They haven't had the institutional capacity to do that. So here in the United States, our elite is over 2 million people, because you can get into it from business. You can be a public servant like Biden. You can do a reality TV show and get elected like Trump. You can be in show business like Reagan. There's any number of ways, and it's a very churny, regenerating system. The Russians do not have that. So this is their last chance in terms of demographics, in terms of economics, in terms of military, in terms of leadership. They have to do it now. The CIA has gotten really good, or NSA, whoever's doing has gotten really good at reading Putin's mail. I know this was under discussion before they really went into lockdown 5 years ago. The degree to which it's driving their day-to-day decision-making, I'm not privy to that, but if they're not, it's a really insane coincidence. It's always been inevitable. There's always been a question of whether it was imminent, and obviously we're there now. There's something that a lot of people in the foreign policy space have been saying for years, that we pushed them into this to a degree, that by expanding NATO, we made them more and more unstable, more and more paranoid. And there's something to be said for that, because the Russians have always known they had to get these gaps. But the only version of Russian security that would have satisfied Russia is if the Russians were able to write the security policies or occupy a number of countries with a combined population of twice of their own. That was never a viable option. So these critics, they're right, but they're also stupid. I don't think the Russians read too much into that one. I think what really drove the Russians to do it like now, like right now, as opposed to 8 years from 8 years ago, but why February, is when Trump was president. I'm sure you remember all the impeachment fun and games. The core issue there was that Trump tried to blackmail the current president of Ukraine, Zelensky, into getting dirt on Hunter Biden in exchange for continuing military support of Ukraine.
This is the phone call, the infamous phone call.
This was the phone call. Well, I mean, it's the Trump administration released the transcript, so it's not, none of this is controversial. Whether or not that's an impeachable offense, I will leave that to Congress. But what we know for sure is that Trump tried to do the blackmail. It didn't work, and so he withheld military assistance. And so the military assistance that had been slowly building up stopped for a couple of years. And it wasn't until we get to the Biden presidency that it picked up again in large scale. And it wasn't until the Biden administration became in power that some of the weapon systems that we had provided, we gave them permission to use them on that eastern front where the separatists were. That started in November of last year. Those weapons finally faced the Russians in November. That's when the buildup in Russia started. They realized that the window for them was closing very quickly. Because if you can operate a Nintendo Game Boy, a Javelin missile's easy. And all of a sudden they were losing armor and trucks to Javelins a dozen a week. And they realized that if they didn't act soon, Ukraine wouldn't be nearly as easy to fall. And now we're in a situation where I think we've provided them with something like 3,000 launchers. So the Russians can still win, but the cost is going to be very, very high. Again, let me play the adoption card here. It's like there are 3 countries in human history that have threatened the United States. Britain, with Lend-Lease in World War II, they became our junior ally. We will never let them out of that position. Mexico, we invaded them. We took half their territory. We're best buds now. Russia, that pointed nukes at us, that still points nukes at us, that never stopped pointing nukes at us. Destabilizing that is kind of hardwired into the American strategic ethos, and it's hard for me to find fault with that. Yeah, I'd actually argue that the Biden administration, which never wanted to get into a war with Russia in the first place, is actually more concerned about that and more concerned about avoiding it now because the Russians have done so badly in Ukraine. We now know that if it comes to a face-to-face fight between American forces and Russian forces, that we will obliterate them. Absolutely. There's no other way this could go. There's for a country with the lack of military expertise, equipment, and funding of Ukraine to be standing up to Russia. Are the Ukrainians overperforming? Sure, but the Russians are they're coming across like the Iraqis in Desert Storm.